Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and wherever you're logging in from. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening in some places. My name is BIZTEK Fancy. I'm the President CEO at BIZTEK and also part of ICCP. And one of the pleasures I have today, and we're going to do it in two parts, is that we have a very distinguished gentleman, Don Godoban, and he's actually has been the co-chairman of the Professional Ethics Committee of ACM, and he's got a phenomenal background. And I don't think there's an industry, you'll see when the PowerPoint goes up as to what his background is. There's no industry he's not touched, would be safe to say, which means defense, retail, all sorts of different things. And it's also global. So he's heavily involved in this topic, I can tell you, and you will get tremendous pleasure. And then what we'll do is there's some slides which we don't normally do, but these are actually very interesting. And then after 40 minutes, we'll stop and then get into the question and answer session. So Don, welcome this morning. Thank you very much for doing this. And you have the screen, and so take it away.
Okay. The first thing is to be sure that I am sharing the screen. Is that the case?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I guess we can start this now. First, I want to thank BIZTEK for the gracious invitation to talk about strategies for addressing ethical risk and for professional responsibility. I've had a rather diverse computing career, building systems as a systems auditor and doing systems research as an academic. And there we go. And now I wonder how many of you have had the following, what I call a pre-COVID experience. You get on a plane and you have the luck to withdraw to find that I need to talk to you, seatmate. One whose first conversational gambit is, what business are you in? If you answer anything that includes the word computing, then you are subject to a rant about problems with computers and how those evil people at Volkswagen corrupted data, or those people at Equifax lost data. I usually change the direction of the conversation by telling them how computerized eye surgery prevented me from going blind, and how my best friend is still here because of a computerized pacemaker. There are people out there using computers to hurt others or to be deceitful for their own amusement or profit. It's unfortunately too easy to list companies, groups, or individuals behaving like this. They're in the minority and don't represent us or our work ethics. We're proud of our work and what we do. The negative view of computer practitioners is not true for most of us. Even in the olden days when I started computing professionals were good, well-intentioned professionals and didn't want to hurt other people. Last century, when computing was emerging as an organized discipline, you were proud if you could get a system to work in some approximation of what the client wanted. I started computing before there was an internet. We used wired technology. Phones actually attached to walls, and you actually had to touch a computer to get it to do something. Computer work was mostly generating reports, business stuff, airplane reservations. Credit cards were just coming in. We didn't even have a spreadsheet software until the 80s. Computing was very specialized knowledge. We were wizards. We did all sorts of magical things with computers. We were ethically neutral. We didn't have to think about that. We just worked with the machines and we did our jobs. It was those other people, the bad guys, who engaged in fraud. I was a straight shooter, John Wayne with a pocket protector. Gradually, the sense of responsibility for what we developed changed as computing impacts broadened. After my eye surgery, I remember how important that new electronic reader was for me. You could read anything on a Kindle just by increasing the font size. Simply select the size font you need, and everything you looked at would be that size. To get to the font change application, just press the key with the upper and lowercase a on it. The key on the keyboard with keys the size of a number 2 pencil eraser. Easily readable by a visually challenged person, right? This program works to change the font size. Perhaps it was even delivered on time and within budget, but it's an ethical failure. The well-intentioned programmer didn't consider the context of those who would need that font enlargement function. You could not see that keys that small. There are similar situations with more significant consequences. There was a dual mode linear accelerator, which would generate different amounts of radiation to treat surface tumors or deep tumors. It would use 150 rad radiation setting to treat surface cancers, and it would increase the radiation to about 2,000 rads, which, when it's unfiltered, is lethal. It would switch between filtered and unfiltered doses by a computerized control. This system used a standard keyboard to input the control. If things were set properly, the operator would press X to fire an X-ray, a nice mnemonic. And if there was a risk to the patient, the operator would press C to cancel. Using the standard keyboard, X and C, fire the X-ray, cancel the X-ray. Do you notice the problem? Several died of radiation burns because of this interface design problem. Death by a typing mistake, fingers pressing X's rather than C's. In a moment, looking at mishaps and other things that are going on, in a moment's thought, you can add to this list of mishaps. I call them mishaps because they're supposedly unintentional problems with systems. These mishaps lead people to now talk about computer ethics and integrity and the importance of having clear statements guiding ethical behavior of computing professionals. We call those clear statements codes of ethics. There has been an evolving understanding of our responsibility. The necessary relation between ethics and technology became clearer over time as computing changed. When I started computing, it was fun, an intellectual challenge. Complete one challenge and move on to the next. Given some of the projects I worked on, I realized new levels of professional responsibility and a need to encourage a responsible approach to our work. I was fortunate. I got to work on the ACM's 1992 Code of Ethics and encouraged the inclusion of some very specific software development standards. But at that point, many of the people in computer science viewed computing as purely a mathematical discipline, rather than one affecting others when the mathematics was applied in the systems they developed. They believed that ethics did not belong in a computer science curriculum. The story was a little different when we developed the Software Engineering Code of Ethics, which was adopted by the ACM and the IEEE and has been adopted by several other countries. The existence of computerized insulin pumps, pacemakers, artificial hearts, and so on made it easier to convince people about the importance of professional ethics. Still, some thought that ethics was only involved in safety-critical systems. October 15th, 5 years ago tomorrow, the CEO of the ACM requested an update of the ACM Code of Ethics. It was an interesting request. The 1992 code was written when ACM was considered a U.S. organization interested primarily in the science of computing. But now the ACM has deep international roots and is interested in all aspects of computing and its impacts on society. In order for an updated code to be approved by the membership, it would need to represent the conscience of a global profession. Relevant elements from that code appear at the bottom of the remaining slides. We need to spend a moment talking about professionalism and professionals to understand the content and place of a code of ethics. Professions have an ethical standard of service to society and a social good that's associated with that profession. So doctors facilitate health, teachers facilitate education, and so on. Being a good information professional involves a practice of two skill sets, one technical, the other ethical. The technical skills are generally acquired through education, apprenticeship, or training. The application of their unique set of skills also requires professionals to have a higher order of care rather than simply following basic minimalistic laws. The concern to maximize the positive effect of those affected by our artifacts goes beyond mere due care, goes beyond mere avoidance of direct harm. So the update process that we were asked to do took 3 years. It involved multiple revisions and review cycles on our comments. Our direction was simple from the start when we wrote this. Instead of focusing on the unique elements of the ACM or some other society in some other country, we would focus on global values of the good computing profession. And if we came close to identifying those global values, there would be little difficulty with the ACM accepting the update. It was worth the effort. 3 years. Well, unfortunately, there are all sorts of people who cast shadows on computing. Other segments of the industry, such as avionics and voting machine systems, take a less acceptable approach to things like testing. They test their own systems, and then they assure us that they meet the standards. Since the system is proprietary and not available for inspection by outsiders, concerns arise especially when the system behaves in unexpected or undocumented ways. In one county in South Carolina, voters could select 2 candidates for a particular office. But the voting machine only recognized one of those candidates, a single candidate. So the software took the voter's second vote and added it to some other race. This resulted in one candidate in that race receiving more votes than there were voters. Obviously, this is not an accurate characterization of most computing professionals. They want to get things done and to do good things. There is clear evidence of this work ethic held by developers in most programming shops and those who contribute to open source software. Nevertheless, unusable software gets produced, or worse, software that reliably and consistently causes harm to individuals or groups gets released more frequently than we would like. In the design of a cockpit interface, there was a mixed mode display unit that was used to show 2 different pieces of information about the descent path of an airplane. The picture is the descent path angle of an airplane flying over a mountain. So it would show the descent path and it would show the vertical speed at which the altitude is changing. Flight path angle of the aircraft and the flight path angle of the aircraft minus 3.3 as seen here with the decimal point meant that it was descending at an angle of 3.3 degrees. While minus 33 without the decimal point meant that the plane was losing altitude at 3,300 feet per minute. In an airplane crash in Italy, evidence indicates that the pilot misread the data and probably did not notice the presence or absence of a decimal point. I know you're saying pilot error. Did not notice the absence of a decimal point. It's not easy to see the presence or absence of a decimal point in a complex environment. This is the environment in which that display was given. In that situation, it was very difficult for the pilot to discern the information. On time, accurate information, within budget, failure. Sometimes known errors generate incomprehensible error messages in inappropriate contexts. The competent completion of any system may have met their technical specifications, but they were failures because they did not meet the less obvious ethical requirements. We mistakenly only focus on the competent technical completion of tasks. The goal of competent completion is deeply ingrained in many software professionals. The focus on completion starts with our computer science classes. Finish one programming assignment, deliver it to the professor, then start on the next one. The manufacturing mindset of getting a product out the door quickly and valuing quantity of the product produced generates problems for software development. A key problem is the failure to realize that software development does not generate some independent standing manufactured product. The manufacturing model often rewards first to market with sufficient product produced inexpensively as long as the minimal requirements are met. By minimizing testing, schedules are more easily met and costs reduced. Unfortunately, for software users, cutting the time for careful design and testing results in a less resilient product. A special challenge for the computing industry is to undo this manufacturing mindset, which starts in the university. Another problem that stems from this manufacturing mindset of equating quantity and quality are certain measures of coder productivity. Paying developers by the number of lines of code they write creates a perverse incentive. Code Vicious, in a recent article for ACMQ, writes, "Many silly metrics have been created to measure work, including the rate at which tickets are closed, the number of lines of code a programmer writes in a day, and the number of words an author can compose in an hour. All of these measures have one thing in common. They fail to take into account the quality of the output. If Alice writes 1,000 lines of impossible read buggy code in a day, and Carol writes 100 lines of well-crafted, easy to read code in the same time, then who should be rewarded? Computing should not be evaluated like piecework. The first choice is to game the system such that you can actually do minimum work to get the maximum benefit, usually by taking on the trivial tasks, those that can easily be completed, and show at the end of the month that you accomplished more tasks than anyone else. In addition to rewarding good coding, applying the manufacturing mindset to developer evaluation actually creates perverse incentives to worry about things other than the quality of one's code. It's human nature to produce more of something if that is what you're getting paid to do. Spending time fixing or improving code is at best not rewarded, and at worst, actively discouraged. After all, if the code works and produces any results, then that is all that matters. In such an environment, an ethically astute developer would be seen as unproductive. What are we talking about when we talk about ethics? One unhelpful view of ethics equates it with legal compliance. For example, ethics can be reduced to a dollar limit on gifts that an employee accepts or solicits from a client. Some companies introduce a 1-hour ethics training course annually, to qualify for a reduced judicial financial penalty if they are caught doing something unethical. It's a gimmick to cut their costs. They offer an ethical checklist, which may have some useful reminders. It's pinned to a wall, and it's never very useful. Another misuse of ethics is something that's gotten the label ethics washing or ethics theater, where companies give the appearance of being very concerned about ethics to avoid the application of external regulations, and yet not doing anything to mitigate or respond positively to ethical concerns that when they arise. For example, promoting AI for good while developing and selling questionable surveillance software is ethics washing. This approach creates dissonance for computing professionals who work there. Often, ethics theater is in play when a corporation caught in a scandal then creates an ethics board or an ethics compliance officer position, one employee. Management of all ethical responsibility requires steering clear of these extremes and landing on a professional ethics that's clear about expectations. Yet we make ethical decisions every day. A workable approach to ethics is to consider it as any behavior that impacts other people. It's simple. Any behavior that impacts other people or society positively or negatively involves ethics. Ethical decision-making involves one's ability to imagine the effects of that behavior on others' lives. Our professional decisions have ethical impacts, and that needs to be recognized. Terry Winograd distinguished between ethics and applied professional ethics using the term ethicking. I love it. Ethics is what is studied in school. Ethicking, ethics in action, a verb and a noun. Ethics in action as a computing professional starts with a set of values found in a code of ethics. I'm going to be using and have been using the ACM Code of Ethics as a guide for our day-to-day activities. Ethics. For many people, the right thing to do seems obvious. Why am I bothering you talking about ethics? You know what to do. Our ethics starts from past experience, from the things we learned from our parents, from religious texts, from the constant social cues around us. However, the issues in computing ethics are often new and require thought beyond that familiar, simple ethical response. That's wrong. Few religious texts, as far as I know, mention Twitter or cyber stalking. Some attribute computer ethics problems to the rapidly changing technology. But I think it is more important for us to focus on what has not changed, namely us. In a talk on professional computing, Tom DeMarco described a position that often leads to ethical issues. He labeled this the fatal premise. Often people believe, he says, evil is done by evil people. I'm not an evil person, so therefore I can't do evil, and I don't have to think about it. Professionals who take this view go into the world ethically unprepared and may simply complete a system without taking a moment's extra time to consider its impact on a broad range of stakeholders. That guy who just had the eye surgery. Professionals who take this view go into the world ethically unarmed. A silly example of the fatal premise is an unsecured Bluetooth app that is used to control water flow and temperature for a bidet. We know what these are now thanks to COVID. But the designers of this bidet never considered the disgruntled spouse or the malevolent neighbor who might choose to scald someone or cause a mess when the bidet's owner is away. The actual stakeholders were not considered in the design. Fundamentally, a professional who adopts the fatal premise has an ethical blank check. The professional believes that anything they do will be acceptable because they are a genuinely good person. Psychological studies on ethical decision-making show that DeMarco's fatal premise is unfortunately common. This premise is nurtured when an organization puts its primary staff development focus just on the technical side, just on the technical skill acquisition. Training on how to consider the impacts of technical decisions on society is at most an afterthought. Without consistent training considering the impact of technology on people, significant issues like all of those we've mentioned before are missed by us good people. Sometimes computing systems fundamentally change the nature of society in ways that we did not consider. It's easy to imagine a medical diagnosis system changing the way doctors make care decisions because it changes their liability calculus. The management of ethics can be further complicated by the mistaken belief that being ethical doesn't contribute to my bottom line. Yet there are clear ways in which ethics does contribute to the bottom line, and research has shown this. Ethical culture contributes to company loyalty, both for the workers and the public. A company that values the ethics can reduce the costs associated with rapid employee turnover. Customers and the public at large respond better to an ethical company. Trustworthy companies who produce trustworthy products may be able to reduce their advertising budgets. All of this has been documented to positively impact the bottom line. As computer developers, one of the ways we manage complex problems is to divide and use a divide and conquer methodology. We narrow our focus to that immediate complex ethical problem. This allows us to frame out any distractions, and that's a plus. But we know from our daily lives that mistakes are often made because we ask questions that are constrained by a particular frame or filter. For example, many communities felt an environmental moral responsibility to introduce recycling programs. I live in one of those. It also happened to bring in some money. Now, unfortunately, recycling makes less money or even costs money. If moral responsibility is framed out of the question and the expense of the recycling becomes the overarching driver for decision making, then it costs money and recycling will stop. The moral imperative has been framed out of the question. If business frames everything in terms of the bottom line, then ethics gets framed out of your decisions. This framing out has a psychological basis. Psychological studies have found that immediate ethical reactions, which involve our quick, intuitive processing of the information because we know the answers, that intuitive processing frequently precedes more ethical decision-making. that's slower, more conscious, and more logical. The ethical decision process takes more cognitive attention in order to consider aspects beyond the way in which situations are framed for us by someone else. It takes cognitive attention to consider relevant elements, to analyze the impact of these elements on our decision, to then review all of that and look at alternate approaches and seeing if things could be done better, and then evaluating which amongst these alternatives is best. Ethicking requires an analysis of the impacts of a system on a broad range of stakeholders, not just on the client and the employer. Every single line of code we write affects other people in the way we write it. How we test a system impacts others. This holistic approach includes responsibilities for individuals, teams, management. Section 3 of the Code of Ethics focuses on the responsibilities that leaders have to support developers in their professionalism and help us give the required attention to all stakeholders. An organization's ethical culture requires support from the top as well, not just us trying to behave ethically. A recognition of a broad range of stakeholders is essential. People should always be a central concern in computing. Beyond this broader public, though, there's an important group of stakeholders, and they're the software developers. The code makes clear how it calls a leadership position to support professional development of individuals. Advancing analytic skills is important, but doing so in a way that integrates the development of ethical abilities is essential. Repeat. Advancing analytic skills is important, but doing so in a way that integrates the development of ethical abilities is essential. Management needs to recognize and promote technical and ethical growth. That cultural change also should involve the hiring process, which is probably memorable for many of you. Most commonly in the hiring process implicitly assumes the fatal premise. It assumes that all potential employees are good people and already know what ethics is, so they only have to have their technical skills evaluated. Some companies have recognized that quality work requires more than technical skills. And what these companies have done is introduce consideration of other important skills during the interviews by asking different sorts of questions. Questions like those shown here address the candidate's underlying awareness of ethical issues. Have the candidates address issues about flexibility, curiosity, work ethic, and their commitment to develop their own ability to be ethically on guard. Ask questions beyond mere technical issues. Give them a problem to see if they're sensitive to issues beyond how to implement code. Ask them, for example, to think about developing an application such as a timer for a COVID ventilator so that it turns the ventilator off for 3 hours after 22 hours of continuous operation. Turns it off for 3 hours after 22 hours while someone is breathing. What concerns would you have about doing this, you might ask them. Candidates may give, and most likely give, technical responses. Well, I need to use this type of language, or I shouldn't use Rust or Forth. But you ask them to give responses to address the socio-technical issues. Who do you have to collaborate with to do this? What sort of concerns would we have for the person attached? Ask them to give us a sense of the potential candidate to develop as a socio-technical problem solver. In order to break away from the manufacturing model, software developers need to demonstrate that they understand that their work is more than meeting mere technical specifications. Using these types of questions helps to get people on board, hire those people with ethical responsibility. But using and developing those skills ought to be rewarded and encouraged. To reinforce the necessity of being ethically on guard includes ethical questions in their performance reviews. A standard practice in code reviews is to evaluate the quality and adequacy of a program's code to accomplish technical functionality. These review sessions on code could easily be modified to include a proactive impact analysis that promotes positive outcomes, that worries about negative aspects on different stakeholders. And these things could be taken care of in advance by simple changes of lines of code, affecting ways in which things are done. As noted earlier, ethicking is hard work. Like any other ability, it takes time and practice to get good at it. Line managers should treat discussions in ethics and socio-technical impacts more like coaching sessions. Make it motivational. It's important that the process remains transparent, credible, and consistent for all staff. These sessions should be conversations where everyone can ask questions and request resources. That is important that line managers take a leadership role in ethicking. Here are some good practices. Use pre-commitment devices to mitigate the important impact of unknowingly adopting the fatal premise and the framing out problem. Review decisions with a friend, publicly sharing your intended ethical choices. Don't jump to rapid emotive responses, but slow the process down, focusing on abstract principles that guide decisions, and think about the values and principles that you believe should guide the decision. Think about or even write out what you would be proud to see in your project review. Identify what you would hope customers and other stakeholders would say about your contribution to the project, what that stakeholder in the seat next to you on the airplane would say. Pre-commitment devices can be used in project plans. Placing the ACM Code of Ethics Principle 1.1, contribute to society and human well-being, in a project plan. And looking at that, including a section that lists some code principles relevant to the project, helps to create an ethical cognitive frame. Engage the team in identifying how those principles are relevant. It's not legally binding, but it will reduce the impact of framing out ethical issues. It's relatively inexpensive and actually has significant returns. Well, it is just possible that there are actually some computer practitioners and organizations that are malevolent miscreants, where the fatal premise or unintentional framing out are not the cause of the problem. There are evil people doing evil things, and there's a need for someone to take action. An unfortunate approach to this need to take action sometimes is a moral bailout by some of us. Quietly finding another job, or worse, actually doing the deed. There's a broad range of positive approaches to these situations. A moral hero may express public outrage and lose their job. Before taking the step of whistleblowing, there may be some other strategies. When the opportunity exists, it may be that it's easier to ask management a simple question, like, what would happen if the newspaper finds out we're doing this? Or maybe ask, wouldn't we get more customers if we made public that we avoided this problem and make improvement a selling point about us? Such simple, well thought out questions might bring about the desired change. And it may even get you rewarded for your insight and warning the company about the risk. There are certainly places where software is developed for the wrong purposes. Those environments do require an ethical hero, someone with the chops to blow the whistle. We hope that these sorts of places are rare and most shops are populated with good people who are interested in developing systems that are good for people. Our concern about this development arises when folks unknowingly adopt the fatal premise and frame out significant issues. Promoting ethics is an essential part of developing systems. It's not an afterthought. We well-intentioned people need to be reminded and need to take positive steps constantly to avoid getting confounded by the complexity of computing and blindly creating technology that is an ethical failure. Thank you. Questions? Questions?
Now we see the relaxed dawn in a fabulous countryside environment. So this was a fantastic, absolutely fantastic, eye-opening presentation for many, many reasons. And I was listening to it very intently, being on that side of the fence with you actually, is as a corporate leader to start with, one of the interesting things is that while you have talked about the coding, the technical profession, the truth is the same principles apply if you're a leader of organization, not just in coding, because if you want this thing to spread and become the daily routine, you better start to lead and operate the same way in your marketing, in your operations, in everything, right from the top. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And what you need, it needs to be genuine. If it's, I've worked with a couple of avionics companies who promote ethics, and they have differing styles. One company, literally, I was about to mention names, I'll stop. One company literally has someone come out and you take a 1-hour mandatory training class in ethics. Another company that I was doing work with, I saw when they were concerned about certain kinds of issues in design and so on and meeting standards, they actually set up an ethics advisor. Their line managers do the ethics training. They don't bring in a dude like me to say, hey, worry about ethics, and then let him go away. Your line manager asks you, what do you think will be the impacts of this? What should we worry about? And if the person says, whether we use a do while or a repeat until loop, you smack him and you say, no, what do we need to worry about when this goes out there? Who might be using it? And this is in fact used in several companies. They have ethics hotlines, and it changes the structure of what's going on in the company. And it's supported financially from the top.
So here's an interesting question that's just coming from Guy. And he's saying, I'm not suggesting AI can solve it all. However, what are your thoughts about leveraging artificial intelligence to assist an enterprise in producing an ethics-driven code for development or developing a product service? What do you think?
All right. I understood what you said in a couple of different ways. One is, letting AI do things and presuming AI can make the ethical decisions and so on, I think is a mistake. Some people have talked about firing off autonomous weapons in warfare where it's totally in control of the AI system, and it makes the decision and it decides what is a reasonable response to what's going on. I don't think that's workable. The business about an AI code of ethics. Everything I've said to you fits the ACM code of ethics, which has now been adopted by some 35 different countries. The ACM has said, here's this code of ethics, and if you want to, you can adopt it as your code of ethics, provided you don't do any changes to it. Just here it is, a good time. And the response to that is that we have seemed to identify the conscience of the profession. There are 170 AI codes of ethics and standards that I know of. I gave a talk to the UN 6 months ago about this. And at that time, there were 170 that I had identified. Codes of ethics have some 9, professional codes of ethics all have about 9 or 10 principles in common. And when you have, quote, an AI code of ethics, you can use most of the standard codes of ethics. The ACM code of ethics has some provisions in it about doing AI. You're following general principles and you're applying them to your application. So there's talk about machine learning and things like that in the ACM code. There's the risk about doing codes of ethics without thinking that you're inventing something new. We've written an article about 6 months ago when the New York Times declared that computer ethics has just been discovered by AI, and talking about it as if it was brand new. I've for 4 decades. And quick answer to the question. If you're going to develop a code of ethics, you better have, like anything you develop in software, a good bunch of people who know what practical ethics is, and people who don't want to talk about the philosophy of nomological danglers or other exciting ethical things. You need practitioners who know what the issues are. You need not to have a checklist. One of the things that the psychological studies on ethics have shown is if you have this checkbox, series of checkboxes, you drop the ethical decision making and you equate ethics with making a check in the box. So I was working with one avionics company when they were designing some airplanes which had multiple sensors on the airplanes to check things out. The standard said, 2167A said, test this piece of the software. The programmer tested one of the sensors in the whole bloody plane and checked the box. If the box says, be honest, and you said, well, I didn't talk to the customer and tell them about the problem, but I didn't lie to them, so I'm being honest, then what you have is a mistake. The study is that in lots of compliance offices that companies have, they have this checkbox. And the checkbox is, you're ethical if you didn't accept a present that was worth more than $50. You're ethical if you didn't buy lunch for the customer. This is not resolving the issue. You need to get the people to think. The code needs to be supported. And so I'm very concerned about the machine generation of AI codes, solving the problem?
I, I think that's very good, and you're absolutely right, because it goes to one of the dangers. Just to add to your thing, is that we know that 60 to 70% of the data in the corporate world is duplicate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it starts here and then changes here drastically, and whether you're doing machine learning or whatever, which data are you really using? And the human judgment of saying no, that was not what was intended. We know what we did is completely out of it. But I want to go back to your original point, which I think is pretty powerful. And we can talk about real example. One of the whistleblower thing that you talked about, in the corporate world, and I don't think it's failed in my career. I've not seen it otherwise. I've seen it every single time. That when you're on top, and I've been in those chairs myself, is that people don't want to hear the bad news, right? Because they're worried about the shareholder value, the quarterly reports, this, that, and the other. Now, let's look at Volkswagen, Boeing 737 MAX, Aquafax, and I think they're on, we can go on with it's a very long list. But if you look at it, in case of Boeing, when we know a lot of pilots actually reported that there's a problem, right? That these things were happening, but somebody saw it and ignored it. In case of Volkswagen, somebody programmed. It's not that they didn't know how to program. They knew how to program, but they did something bad. And they did this thing till somebody, person from outside, third party, told them. And even it was ignored a few times. The question is there not a potential need for an internal whistleblower, internal, whose job is not to fire people and judge people, but to see if we cannot start to get the training? As the training is going on, you can use the real examples to turn around and say, okay, that's not how we expect you to do, and let me explain to you, here's why. But also understand, why did you do that? So either he did it because he didn't understand, because he was either misguided, or he was actually a bad guy. And you can eliminate as you start to understand why they did that. Isn't there a potential need for an internal whistleblower whose job is not to start shooting at people, but understand, and then at some point in time, you'll train people. Now you don't tolerate, right?
I don't want to use the word whistleblower, Fancy.
Okay.
There's a need for a person who taps you on the shoulder and says, are there any problems with that? Might there be some kind of difficulty? It's a the notion of a whistleblower is someone who, from the inside, takes the information, goes outside, and says to the world, "Look at you! You're a bad. They're a bad person." Much more effective. And I mean, the examples, the two examples I used, saying maybe we could fix this and brag about it. One of the problems with computing flaws and talking about unethical behavior is people are afraid to say publicly that there was this problem. But think of the company now that looks at font enlargement software. And 90% of the font enlargement software starts with a set of instructions in size 8 font, which can't be read. So if you're visually challenged, you can't get to the, say it gently, you can't get to the wonderful program that will enlarge the font. But it was satisfying a disability requirement or something like that because it was there and you can't get to it. I have a ramp on a building that you can use a wheelchair on, but the ramp is 600 meters from the nearest parking lot. What are you going to do? You need a person who encourages this stuff, but The problem with a person who encourages this stuff is just like the problem having me here, because I'm the guy waving the ethics flag. When we shut this down, if the people who are listening to this forget it, nothing happens. You need them to constantly be on guard, to think about the thing we, as computer scientists, seldom think about, the impact of our work. I find computing great fun because of the intellectual challenge. Can I get a system to do this? Can I make this work? And all of a sudden, I haven't looked outside of the system to see how it's going to affect people. When I was developing telecommunication systems, and we were developing charge card systems before there were national ones, we had communication lines going across the state of Pennsylvania because it was going to be a in-state charge card. And it was amazing it didn't work because the people on the other end, I was on the East Coast and they were on the West Coast of Pennsylvania. They aren't coasts, but anyway, the west side of Pennsylvania. In those days, the time it took the signal to go by wire through numerous places, the people at the other end were too impatient. And they introduced timeouts. So if a person went 1, 2, 3, 4 to get their 4th PIN number in, it was too slow and it timed out. Because they were used to the response within their building. You need someone not who figures out you're evil, but who does come and put their hand on your shoulder and say, how's it doing? What are you thinking about? I mean, we have these absurdities that go on. Google face recognition. When a while back, they had built the system, testing it on fair-skinned people, and all of a sudden, when you did face recognition, it could not recognize dark-skinned people. And so it would see dark-skinned people with eyes and nostrils and a mouth, and would not classify them as human. This was not intentional. I'm quite sure the guys who worked for Google who did this were thrilled at what they had done for being able to focus on a face. But someone should have said to them, you know, there's more people around than there are people in this office, and they look a little different. How does it work on them? That question would have changed things. It would have enhanced Google's reputation. It was worth their effort. That's not a whistleblower. If you get to the disasters, the ones you know about, like Volkswagen, then you hope that somebody at some level will take some action. The action can be powerful, or it can be simple. Suppose someone had said to Volkswagen, you know, there are programmers who may talk about what we're doing. What happens if this becomes public? And they would have seen that the impact on their reputation had a greater financial impact, or we hope they would have seen. There's some optimism here. You presume that you're dealing with rational people. When you're dealing with irrational people, saying things like, we should worry about our relationships in a global environment, doesn't carry through. So yes, there should be some assistance, but it should occur at all levels. And having the individual person sometimes leads us to go, it's their job and then we go back into the fatal premise mode because it's their job.
Don, this is very powerful because one other thing everybody hears around the world today is that every company is an IT company. McDonald's, you are an IT company. You look at it, especially since COVID-19, literally everyone is an IT company because we are using this to order food, groceries, whatever.
Right.
We're using this to actually order coffee and then pick it up or get it delivered or whatever. Effectively, this means that the impact now is spreading, which means that the corporate world, not just the technology, the mindset better change in the corner suite to say, am I doing all the right things here, ethically, morally? Am I doing this? If not, what do I do to fix this, right? And and get rolling on this. Would you agree with that as a concluding thing?
That
the mindset in the corner suite has to change. That we are an IT company. We really, all of us are IT companies.
Yeah, I hesitate.
Okay.
Because I've encountered my example of using our mistake as a selling point. Right. I can tell you that there's a very large IT company on the East Coast of the United States. When I was doing some audit stuff for them and they found this out, the CEO was wonderful. And he said, we're going to fix that. And several of his VPs sitting at this table overlooking Boston Harbor started going, oh yeah. And he said, no, we're going to use it as a selling point that we discovered it and fixed it. And they did do that. And the company is still in existence and thriving. And so you get, the education goes both ways.
Yes.
The programmer can say, we need to do this. I think part of I had entered the world as a philosopher and put on a Harry Potter cloak and became a computer person. Becoming a computer person, I moved fairly quickly, I think, because I would say, we could make this better, sticking in this one line of code. I mean, that airplane crash that I talked about, where you had minus 3.3 and then a 33, the 33 meant 3,300 feet per second dropping.
Right.
If they had just put 2 zeros after that 33, you would have had minus 3.3 as the angle, 3,300, and you would have discerned that you were looking at a different thing from the distance because of 2 zeros. Now, I'm going to minimize the amount of effort needed in doing that, but that's 2 lines of code. That's half a day's programming work and a week's worth of testing. But that plane wouldn't have crashed.
It would have saved lives.
And it was done from the bottom. It could have been done from the bottom because someone asked. We have, long ago, in the Persian Gulf, we used the Aegis radar system, and we shot down a commercial airliner by mistake. Part of the reason we shot that airliner down was because the information was on huge 20-foot screens, 40 feet away, 50 feet away, 20 feet away from the person looking at these screens. You could see flight paths. You have a button in your hand. You're standing in the middle of a 50-mile of water, and there's a plane coming that looks like it's descending. And your question is it an enemy plane, what is its engine signature? That information was on a computer monitor 20 feet away from the person standing there looking at the big screens. You have big screens, it's designed, I'm going to be 20 feet back. You have the information details that you need about engine signature and so on under those huge monitors on a computerized screen. Here's a person knowing that if he doesn't push this button in a second and a half, he may be killed by these people. The information he needed, telling him whether it was an attacking plane or a commercial plane, was a number 20 feet away on a monitor. Nobody's vision is that good in a tense situation. Person chose to push the button and killed 249 civilians. I ask my intro computer science students, what could you have done so that he didn't have to run up to that monitor that wouldn't cost any money? Think about the situation the person is in and what could you have done? And freshman college students said, make the screen blink if it's a problem. And he could see it from 20 feet. Make the screen blink. Tell me how much that costs. Tell me how much that major organization would have saved in embarrassment and because they didn't kill almost 300 civilians. And that would have come with someone on the line looks at his manager and says, should we make it blink so it's easier at a distance? And knowing the corporate world, the manager would have said, yes, but don't take too much time. Then the manager, when he had dinner with the vice president of the company, says, you know, I modified this so we wouldn't have this problem. And the manager would take credit. And the vice president would then tell the president, and you've changed corporate culture.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's overly optimistic, but I know that has happened in some environments.
But I think it's true. What you're saying is don't paint it on, bake it in. And you bake it in over a period of time.
Oh, right? That's wonderful.
Right?
Okay, yes.
Right? It's baking right. It in. Because what we're doing in the corporate world today, and I think you identified in this thing, I'm thinking about what's the best way to describe it. And the best way to describe it is we're painting things on rather than actually baking it in. And I think it's very powerful. And yeah, you can.
I ask your permission to steal that phrase.
But absolutely, because I used it actually at one of the board meetings at Visa, because I was asked this question, and I go, you know, we have a tendency sometimes to do this because of the banking world. It goes to what you said, right? It's ethicking versus theater, right? Never mind the theater.
Right.
Do the right thing, right?
Yep.
Is what you're talking about. That's very powerful. I think this is a brilliant stuff you've done today. And I know that people will want to look at it and hear it again because it really goes hand in hand with the code of ethics that you were instrumental in producing, that we are using. And I think it's fantastic. So I hope people will go and look at it again. And if I was a leader in a corporation, I would want to hear this again and again to say, okay, what do I do now? It's my role and the role of the management, and then the next one and the next one, to make it a culture, exactly as you talk about.
And if sometimes people say there isn't this kind of interest in ethics, the code of ethics that we worked on internationally, that had thousands of people contributing, people who were ACM members, people who were from the Finnish Computer Society, from China, from Japan, and so on. I mean, it was an amazing effort. That particular code of ethics, the ACM is freely making available for other organizations to adopt. So it has been now adopted by the International Federation of Information Processing. Some 40 some odd countries have now adopted this code. So it exists alongside of their. So if industry people say there is no standard, they ought to take a deep breath and say, 40 countries and individual companies, and ICCP in itself has also adopted
Right.
this code
Right.
as a standard.
No, it's
So
very
there is
good.
this model out there. And the fact that there is this common standard that exists across nations means that when I go to Japan to work and someone says, do this, I can say it will violate the code of ethics. And they may say, well, that's an ACM code. And I can point to them that it's still in Japan and it's international.
Exactly. And I'm going to try and link it side by side, because it will be linked to the code, the ACM code that we're using,
Okay.
Code of Ethics, which is fantastic to tie it together, because really you use that as the base to talk about it, and it's fantastic. I think it's brilliant what you've just done today, and I want to thank you at the bottom of my heart.
Okay.
I think, Don, it was fabulous.
Thank you very much. And I'll talk to you in our other meeting later.
Yes, at 2 o'clock. That's right. Take care, Don. All the very best.
All right.